Okay, so this is seed plant. So this is plant diversity 2. We've already covered the non-seed plants in plant diversity 1. We already covered the mosses and the ferns. This will cover the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, basically the seed plants. This is chapter 30 in your textbook, about 16 pages or so, page 634 to 650. So seed plants include the oldest organisms on Earth. This is what is shown here in Oregon. In Utah. This is the quaking aspen. The quaking aspen is basically a forest, and it's a forest made up of a single organism. And that single organism is clonal. So basically, it clones itself and regrows through the roots a new tree. And so basically, over 80,000 years, this forest has developed from the same exact organism reproducing itself over and over and over. Not necessarily reproducing, it's not a new generation, it's the exact same thing, it's the exact same organism, but just popping up in a new place. And so these are angiosperms, these are flowering plants, which are seed plants. So why are seed plants so successful compared to non-seed plants? And there are two big adaptations that seed plants have that non-seed plants do not have. And of course, the number one thing here is seeds, having seeds. Non-seed plants, by definition, do not have seeds. Why is that bad for them? Well, spores, which is what the moss use and which is what the ferns use, which is what we talked about in the last lecture, spores have no nutrition within them for the embryo to survive on. And spores do not have this tough seed coat that seeds have. And so because of these two big reasons, seeds can last a longer period of time, and they can go through a lot of very dangerous, very harmful conditions and not be harmed, where spores are much more liable to be harmed by those kinds of things. So these are the two main evolution advantages that these things allow for. So increased dormancy. Basically, these seeds can last a very long period of time because having the nutrition and having this tough seed coat. And they have improved transport as well. So basically, a lot of seeds have adaptations for traveling long distances. For example, think of a coconut. A coconut is a seed. A coconut is going to be able to float on the water and therefore travel a long distance. And then when it reaches the shore, it can basically germinate and become a new plant in a very far off location. Same thing with like maple seeds, which have some people call like helicopters. They have those little wings on them. And so they basically are allowed to fly with those adaptations. Or burrs that stick to your pants or stick to your clothing, or that are evolutionarily adapted to stick to fur. All these are adaptations that seeds have to improve their transport away from where they came from. 1 second. Okay. So the second big adaptation here is pollen. And so pollen is basically the male, the gamete, basically the package that holds the male gamete. And this allows for fertilization without water. And as you can see, I emphasize that there because pollen allows for a method for the male gamete to get to the female gamete without having water involved. And so as we talked about with the moss and with the ferns, you needed water to get from that male gamete producing organ to the female gamete producing organ. That's not so for seed plants. You do not need water. That's going to be a big point. So some life cycle differences in seed plants versus some other plants talked about. All seed plants are what we call heterospores. Now, hetero, of course, means different, and spores is talking about the spore. So they have different types of spores. What I mean by that is that they have a megaspore and they have a microspore. Whenever you see the term mega, you should associate, or the prefix mega, you should associate that with female. Okay, so a megaspore is a female spore. A microspore is a male spore. Micro is associated with male. Now, if you recall with the moss and the ferns, we only had spore, right? There was no mega, there was no micro, because moss and ferns are homospores. Homo, of course, meaning one or same. And so they have the same type of spore regardless of the sex. And so in moss and ferns, you'd have one organ. That one organ produces a spore. Spore flies off, lands, produces a hermaphroditic gametophyte, right? That gametophyte that comes from the spore has girl parts and boy parts. In our seed plants, it gets a little more complicated because you have two lines now. You have a female spore that produces a female gametophyte, and you have a male spore that produces a male gametophyte. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. We're basically splitting it into two sexes because we don't have a hermaphroditic gametophyte. So megaspore, as I mentioned, is the female. Microspore, which we know as basically pollen, is the male spore. Okay, and so in one of our examples of seed plants shown here, pine tree, right? You have two types of pine cones. Most of you are probably familiar with the one on the right because you see it all the time. It lands. It's on the ground a lot and it's very visible. It's bigger. That's the female spore-producing organ. The one on the right, the one on the left there, you may not know this, but there's two types of cones on a pine tree. There's a female cone and a boy cone. Female cones are on the right, the one you're familiar with. The boy cones on the left. That's where the pollen comes from. So if you get allergies, like I do in May, that's who's to blame. The male pine cones, because that's where all the pollen's coming from, and that's what is basically making you sneeze. There you go. So there's 7 male cones there, and you're 1 female cone. So here is our just a little explanation of megaspore versus microspore. Notice you have the ovulate cone up top, and so ovulate cone, just basically female cone, also called a megastrobilus, basically mega again, female. Strobilus is just another term for an organ that has a lot of sporophylls on it. Sporophylls are like spore-producing leaves. So let's see if I can do this. All those, nope, okay, it's kind of all those little scales on a pine cone are basically used to be leaves. And so you put a bunch of sporophylls together and you get a strobilus. And so that's what a female cone is. It's a megastrobilus. Megastrobilus inside of it produces the megaspores. Same thing with the boy. You have the male pine cone is called the microstrobilus. Right? Same thing, just replace the prefix. And inside the microstrobilus are the microspores, basically the pollen. Pollen flies to the megastrobilus on the wind, combines with the megaspore, so megaspore plus microspore, voila, you have an embryo, baby little pine tree. And then the scale flies away, lands, that's basically the seed, and then it sprouts a new plant. So let's talk about the boy parts first. We'll talk about the girl part second, mainly because the boy parts are a little more easier. The girl part's a little more complicated. So the boy parts here, like we said, the microspore is the immature pollen. And so the pollen has to develop a little bit, get a coating, and it becomes a pollen grain. And then, so pollen is basically the male gametophyte. And so remember when we talked about moss and ferns, we had gametophyte, which is haploid, and basically the gametes, which are produced by the gametophyte, combine to produce a sporophyte. Right? Sporophyte produces spores. Gametophyte produces gametes. Okay, you can go by that prefix to remember which one produces what. So in our case, with the seed plants, your gametophyte is so tiny all it is the inside, basically the pollen, inside of that cone, that male cone, you have a pollen grain. And that pollen grain is the gametophyte. That is the haploid portion of the seed plant's life cycle. The entire rest of the plant, the roots, the leaves, the trunk, the entire tree, all of the cones, everything is sporophytic, except inside those cones you have pollen, gametophytic, haploid, and inside the girl cones you have the egg, gametophytic. Everything else is diploid, everything else is sporophyte. Okay, so basically the whole idea of reproduction, like we said before, the pollen is released by those microstrobili, the boy cones, in the spring, and as we hate so much, and when that happens, pollen's flying everywhere. Some of it lands on the girl cones. When it does, it's going to basically pollinate the megaspore, the egg, and produces sperm, and that's going to pollinate or fertilize the egg. Okay, so pretty simple. With girl parts, you have we're talking inside the megastrobilus, so inside the girl cone. You have the scale, as you can see here. See that cone has lots of little scales on it, right on both sides. And inside of that ovulate cone, you have the ovule. So basically, inside of the scale, you have an ovule, and inside of the ovule have some parts. So I'm going to go from outside to inside. Surrounding the ovule, you have something called an integument. Notice that is still part of the sporophyte. It's diploid. Integument is just a protective structure. And then you have inside of the integument, you have the megasporangium. So notice has the word spore in it. So this is still sporangium. So sporangium is still a diploid sporophytic structure. And that sporangium, that megasporangium, that is what is actually going to be going through meiosis to produce your megaspore, which you can see there in the middle. Okay, so as you can see, 2N to N, so it's going through meiosis to produce the megaspore from the megasporangium. And that megaspore is basically the egg. Basically the female gametophyte. Okay, so the megaspore grows up inside the megastrobilus, if we're talking about pine trees and things. If we're talking about angiosperms, flowering plants, this would be inside the flower, and we'll talk about that later. And it grows up and becomes the female gametophyte. The female gametophyte inside of it, by mitosis, is going to produce the egg. Okay, and that's what gets fertilized by the sperm of the male gametophyte, which is the pollen. Okay, so to sum up, male gametophyte, pollen, and that's going to be producing the male gamete, right, which is sperm. Female gametophyte is the megaspore, and that produces the haploid egg. So the process of pollination, like we talked about, is just transferring that microspore, which is the same thing as pollen, transferring that microspore to the megaspore, which is inside of the female cone. And so the transfer of that microspore, aka pollen, to the other seed plant containing the ovule, which in the gymnosperm's case is the female cone, is pollination. Once that happens, once the pollen lands on the cone, it's going to grow a little tube. Or if we're talking about angiosperms, it lands on the flower. It's going to grow a little tube, as you can see in this image. And it grows that tube down, through the parts it has to get through that it doesn't care about, and it's going to go through that tube's going to go all the way down to the egg, wherever that egg is. If it's inside of a cone, we're talking about gymnosperms. It's going to go to that egg inside of the cone. If we're talking about angiosperms, it's going to go down that style all the way to the ovary, into the ovule, to the egg. Okay, that's the pollen tube. Pollen tube grows from pollen, and you'll look at that. You'll look at this in lab. And then inside that pollen tube is hollow, and as we talked about before, the male gametophyte, the pollen, is going to be producing sperm cells. Those sperm cells travel through that tube, through that pollen tube, and then they are going to hit the egg. Voila, fertilization occurs once that sperm meets that egg. Okay? So this is showing you the same thing I showed you a few slides ago, where I showed you the unfertilized female scale of the cone, right? But now we're showing fertilization sort of in action, right? This is still unfertilized, right? The pink here is the female parts, and the blue here is now the male parts, because the male has arrived. Pollination has occurred. The pollen has landed on the cone. It has grown a pollen tube. You can see that opening at the bottom. That's where the pollen tube is going to reach to. And then the sperm have traveled through that pollen tube into the egg. So now you have the egg nucleus combining with the sperm nucleus, fertilization. Okay, so what does this become now? When do we get a seed? Well, once you have fertilization happen, you get a seed. Okay, that's when the split is. Pre-fertilization, it's just the female parts here and the male parts here. Post-fertilization, once you have that sperm from the male combined with the egg of the female, you have a seed. Okay, so let's see what that looks like structure-wise. Okay, post-fertilization, voila, we have a seed. So the entire ovule, the entire female reproductive part, turns into a seed. And so let's look at those parts that we named before, the integument, the megasporangium, the megaspore. What do they become? Well, as you can see at the top, the first one there, the integument, which surrounded the megasporangium, the integument becomes the seed coat. Okay? You can think of this as, for example, if you've ever opened peanuts before, you open that hard shell and you get usually 2 little peanuts in there. And then the peanut itself has that waxy, filmy layer over it. That is the seed coat. Okay, so inside of that is going to be what's next, which is the food supply. Okay, just inside of it, what we normally eat, right, with the peanut, that we're eating eating the food supply, which is the female gametophytic tissue. Basically, that was the megasporangium. The megasporangium became the food supply. Okay? What happened to the megaspore? Well, as you know, the megaspore combines with the microspore. Basically, I guess that's not technically correct. What really correct is the megaspore produces the egg, and the egg combines with the sperm, which is produced by the microspore. So, yeah. So once those sperm and egg combine, you produce the embryo, right, which is going to become the baby plant. Okay? The embryo is diploid. The food supply, as you can see here, is actually haploid. The seed coat is still part of the old plant, so that's still diploid. Okay? And as I said, the embryo is going to become our new baby plant, our new sporophyte, after germination occurs. At this point, we have basically a new sporophyte generation growing inside of the tree, which is the old sporophyte generation. So what we'll get into here, we've talked a little bit about plant taxonomy already. we've talked about liverworts and mosses and hornworts and lycopodiophytes, and pteridophytes last lecture. Now we're focused on the bottom two. We'll focus on the seed plants. Notice number 3 there at that node. That is the most recent common ancestor of both gymnosperms and angiosperms. That's when seeds evolved. Okay, so gymnosperms and angiosperms are going to be our seed plants. So let's talk about the gymnosperms first. Gymnosperms are basically plants with a cone. Pine trees. Think of, for example, any conifer you can think of, juniper, fir. All these are going to be gymnosperms. Usually these are evergreens, so plants that are going to be maintaining their needles throughout the year. But they don't have all needles. They don't all have needles. Some have actual leaves. So we'll talk about that. So gymnosperm basically means naked seed, basically because their seeds are not covered by this fleshy fruit. They don't have fruits. And so because of that, they're exposed. Once this cone opens, the seeds are exposed, and so that's why they're called naked seeds. So gymnosperms, basically, as I said, plants that do not have a fruit, they do not have flowers, but they do have seeds. And so the sporophytes are going to produce the seeds in cones. As we said before, the cone is actually, technically can be called a strobilus. Okay, plural of that is strobili. The gametophyte is, again, either the pollen or it's going to be inside the scale of the cone, which we already described, which is basically the megaspore. Okay, so again, all male parts will have micro in front of them. All female parts will have mega in front of them. So, as I said earlier, the sporophyll is basically just a leaf that is producing spores. Phyll is the suffix that means leaf. And of course, sporo means spore or spore producing. So spore producing leaf. So all the scales on a pine cone are sporophylls. If it's a girl pine cone, they're all megasporophylls. If it's a boy pine cone, they're all microsporophylls. The cone itself, as I've said, is called a strobilus. And so for girls, girl cone, megastrobilus, boy cone, microstrobilus. And so here's an example of a girl cone. Each of those is a megasporophyll. The entire thing is called a strobilus. On the left is a male cone, or many male cones. So these are many microstrobili. Okay, so the gymnosperm life cycle, I'm not going to go through all that I just went over. That was just a general overview of seed plants, and so it works for gymnosperms and angiosperms. But one specific thing you have to remember about gymnosperms, gymnosperms are less successful than angiosperms, the flowering plants. The reason they are less successful, there are a few reasons, but one of the big reasons is that gymnosperms are not pollinated by animals like angiosperms are, right? Angiosperms, you have bees, and you have bats, and you have birds, and you have flies, and you have all these other things that go to the flower and then go to another flower and then go to another flower and transfer pollen from flower to flower to flower. Doesn't happen in gymnosperms. So gymnosperms have to rely on the wind, just random wind currents to take their pollen from the boy cone to the girl cone. Okay? That is obviously much less effective than having your own little slave do the work for you, going to plant to plant to plant. So, so this is how they get pollinated. Fertilization is going to occur inside, as we just said, the megastrobilus, inside one of those scales. So the life cycle, basically, after you have that whole fertilization process and then, the pollination process occur and then the fertilization process occur after that, you then produce the seed. as we talked about. The seeds are produced in the megastrobilus, right? Every one of those scales in a female cone will produce a seed, okay? That megastrobilus opens, and when that megastrobilus opens, all those seeds get released, fly away, land in the soil, produce a new sporophyte. Interestingly, a lot of pine trees and gymnosperms, at least a lot of the conifers, are going to be adapted to environments that have a lot of fire. And so these are fire-adapted plants. And so oftentimes these cones will stay sealed and unopened until a fire runs through and burns off all the leaves and needles and things on the forest floor. Doesn't hurt the trees, because if you've ever seen a pine tree, it has really thick bark that prevents fire from damaging the tissues. So the fire will run through that forest, burn off all the leaves, burn off all the pine needles and things, not damage the trees, and then the heat from that fire will open those cones. All the seeds fly out, and when they finally land on the soil, voila, they have fresh soil to land on and germinate, because all the leaves and pine needles have been burned off. And so a lot of these gymnosperms, especially the conifers, are fire adapted, is what we say. Okay, so here is the beautiful gymnosperm diagram. Know this, remember this, study this, because this you will probably see this one or the angiosperm one on an assessment, and I'll ask you things like point to the archegonium, or point to the megastrobilus or the microstrobilus or whatever. To summarize this, we already talked about the top, right? We have the top side there is going to be the female megastrobilus with the ovules inside, producing the megaspores from the megasporangium. And then we have the other part there, which is the microsporangia inside the microstrobilus, and the microsporangia are producing the microspores. Microspores basically are pollen grains, fly away in the wind. They pollinate the female cone, and the scales on the female cone, they travel to them on the wind, and then fertilization occurs when the pollen grains grow their pollen tube. The sperm goes down into the scale, and the sperm combines with the egg, which is produced by the megaspore inside of that scale. At that point, voila, you have a seed, and so that's showing you down here at the bottom here, right here. Here's basically your sperm combining with your egg, and then you have on the other side there your seed being produced once fertilization occurs. Fire may happen, heat opens up those cones, seeds fly away, land, produce a new sporophyte, give it, 50, 60 years, whole thing happens again, right, in a new tree. So that's our life cycle of our gymnosperm. So when it comes to taxonomy of our gymnosperms used to be super, super successful. Okay, we talked about the forests of the club moss. Did we talk about that? I don't know if we talked about that, but anyway, there used to be lycopodiophytes used to be super dominant. Hundreds of millions of years ago, they were one of the dominant plants on Earth. And what slowly replaced those lycopodiophyte and fern forests were gymnosperm forests. Gymnosperms, with their seeds and their ability to have long dormancy and travel far distances, and the seeds were much more effective than spores. And because of this, the gymnosperms outcompeted and dominated those club moss rainforests and replaced them. Today we have around 1,000 living species of gymnosperm. Sounds like a lot. It's not, especially when you consider we have like over 250,000 flowering plant species. 1,000 is nothing. And there's four main subclasses of gymnosperms. The first are the cycads. And so cycads are known for having a huge central strobilus. And you can see that in these pictures here, right in the middle of the plant, there's this huge strobilus. Usually this is the megastrobilus, and the microstrobili are smaller. They have these huge leaves that look like palm tree leaves. They're not. Palm trees, right, are producing coconuts, so they are actually angiosperms. These guys produce cones, so they're not flowering plants. They used to have a huge high diversity, right? Those gymnosperm rainforests we talked about, a lot of them were made up of cycads. Those rainforests were made up of millions and millions of cycads that dominated the earth at that time. But after 65 million years ago, with that mass extinction, a lot of the cycads went extinct, and their abundances and their species richness dropped. They have fairly low diversity today, not nearly as successful as they used to be. But you can still see them time to time. For example, I've seen them in like gas stations because they're commonly purchased by companies as being decorative plants, and so therefore they're used as decoration around businesses and things like that. They're fairly pretty, and they're not very messy, and so that's why. Ginkgoidae is basically are going to be a second subclass. This only contains one species, Ginkgo biloba, and oftentimes you see these small little round spherical structures on the left there. You see them. People mistake these for fruit. They look like fruit, so it's understandable. They are not fruit. They are cones. They're basically inside. You have the scales of the cone, but there's a fleshy surrounding to that cone. The Ginkgo biloba, basically we know about it because commonly it's used in medicines, natural medicines, and also it's also planted like the cycads as an ornamental plant. One of the reasons for this is because it has a very high tolerance to air pollution, and so oftentimes it's planted in heavy urban areas where there's a lot of pollution, and it doesn't just die and they waste their money on a plant. So therefore it's fairly popular, and commonly in city areas they plant the male rather than the female, because the female produces these fleshy cones which when crushed have a pretty nasty smell to them, and so usually they plant the males which don't have those fruity cones. Our third group are kind of a weird mix of plants. Netids. Netids, as I said, have weird appearances. They're very, very diverse. Excuse me. So they possess something called vessel elements, which are basically types of xylem that is going to be flat at the top and flat at the bottom. The reason this is interesting is because vessel elements is a derived character, one that is usually only found in more advanced species. For example, when we get to the angiosperms, the flowering plants, they all have vessel elements. Most gymnosperms have something called tracheids, which are usually elongated and pointed at the top and the bottom of these xylem vessels or xylem cells, and so it's a little weird to see vessel elements in a gymnosperm group, but they got them. There's only 3 genera left today. You see them here pictured. There's Ephedra, Needham, and Welwitschia. Welwitschia is of particularly interesting note because Welwitschia only grows in the deserts of southern Africa, and as you can see here, and it has only grows in its entire life 2 leaves, and these 2 leaves basically just split lengthwise to become multiple more leaves, and so but technically it's 2 leaves just split multiple times, and it comes out of the ground to produce its cones to allow pollination, fertilization to happen. So a little weird. our last group are the most common gymnosperms, and those are the conifers. These are probably also the ones that you are most familiar with when you think of gymnosperms. They are the largest subclass, most diverse subclass, and most conifers are evergreen, so they keep their chlorophyll throughout the year. They do drop some of their pine needles, their needles every so often, especially during the winter, but most of them are kept. Interestingly, juniper is a conifer. Or a lot of people confuse juniper with a angiosperm because they look like they actually call them juniper berries. Again, they're not berries. They're not even fruits. Those are fleshy cones. Okay, just like the ginkgo. It has cones that are fleshy. So conifers are the dominant plants in boreal forests. So boreal forests are the forests within northern hemisphere. For example, Russia, Canada, northern U.S., Scandinavia. These areas are just dominated by huge swaths of boreal forests. And those boreal forests are basically 90% gymnosperms. So these boreal forests are actually one of the world's largest carbon sinks. And it is the world's largest terrestrial carbon sink. I have to say terrestrial because the world's largest carbon sink is really the ocean. The ocean absorbs a lot of carbon that we as humans are putting into the atmosphere. But the second biggest are these boreal forests because there's so many plants going through so much photosynthesis that they're absorbing a lot of CO2 to do that. So a carbon sink is any area that sucks up carbon from the atmosphere. And we rely a lot on boreal forests for a lot of furniture made of pine and made of softwood. Softwood is basically gymnosperm wood, and paper, toilet paper, paper towels, writing paper. All these things are usually from gymnosperms, from conifers. Also, conifers also include the oldest non-clonal organism in the world, right? We said in the beginning that the oldest organism in the world was the 80,000-year-old quaking aspen in Utah. But the oldest non-clonal organism in the world is the bristlecone pine, which can live over 5,000 years. Sequoia is also a very old and very large gymnosperm. So these are sort of conifers of note. Very old, very big. Angiosperms are going to be the next big group we'll talk about. Angiosperms are flowering plants. Anything with a flower is an angiosperm. Anything that produces a fruit is an angiosperm. Angiosperms are the most successful plant group today in the world. They are the most diverse plant lineage in the world today. And they are the only plants that make flowers, and they are the only plants that produce fruit. Angiosperms basically went through an adaptive radiation to all land and many aquatic habitats a few 100 million years ago. Okay, so if we look at the graph of the abundance in diversity, you can see on the y-axis there that the number of genera, basically how many groups, taxonomic groups there are of certain plants. We can see in the red, angiosperms just today just way outcompeting all the other plants. Angiosperms are up to 250 different genera, and our cycads, as you can see, there used to be dominant, but then they slowly dropped off. Ferns, same thing. Gymnosperms, same thing, go up and then back down again, etc. Angiosperms, super successful. So why? Why are the angiosperms so successful? What were the keys to angiosperm success? Number one is, of course, many of them have a short life cycle, and they go through rapid growth. remember how I was just talking about, oh, the oldest tree in the world is bristlecone pine, lives for 5,000 years. The sequoia, this other gymnosperm, is huge and it lives for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. Angiosperms have a different reproductive strategy. Instead of being really old and living for a long time and then taking 100 years to actually produce a cone, or they live, for example, for a few years. Some of them do live for hundreds of years. There's a lot of diversity, obviously, but a lot of them, like annuals that you plant in your garden, or biannuals that live for 2 years. Even some perennials just last a few years, and then that's their life cycle. But they do this, and then within the first year, bam, they're producing flowers, they're producing fruit, they're reproducing. Second year, same thing. Third year, same thing. Fourth year, same thing, if they live that long. But then the gymnosperms sort of have the opposite. They're like, I'm going to grow for 50 years, and then I'll produce a cone, right? So it's just a different reproductive style. And this reproductive style that the angiosperms evolved to become is much more successful today than the gymnosperm style. Number 2 is having flowers. Big advantage. We talked about that with the mutualism with bees and birds and bats and things. Big advantage there. We'll talk more about that. And of course, specialized pollination and dispersal structures. So basically, specialized flowers that allow for example, bees can only enter one way, and when they enter, they have to pass by the pollen producing structure, and therefore they have to get pollen on their bodies, and then they fly away. And then also dispersal structures. The seeds themselves have burrs on them, or fly, or float, or stick, or do whatever to travel long distances. And so, as I just said, bees, bats, birds, ants, flies, all these pollinators, they basically adaptively radiated as well when angiosperms came on the scene with flowers. So when flowers evolved, the pollinators co-evolved and adaptively radiated, became lots and lots of different species when the flowers were basically evolving. And this is called coevolution, when you have two things sort of feeding off of each other, where one thing changes, and when that one thing changes, the other thing changes in response. And when it changes in response, the other thing changes, and the other thing changes. So they co-evolve with each other. You can think of the pollinators and the plants they pollinate as co-evolving together. They're in a mutualism, and so it would make sense that they always want to be right in line with each other, so they're working well together. And so their selective evolutionary pressure is, their strongest selective evolutionary pressure is each other. And so I mentioned the fruits that do a lot of weird things: floating, sticking, flying, and some seeds that can survive animal digestive tracts, right? So a lot of seeds have evolved to pass through the gut of, say, a cow. And then when the cow poops it out, it has nutrients, the poop itself, to help that seed grow. And so seeds have evolved to do that as well. So these are the big 3 keys to angiosperm success. Let's talk about flowers a little bit. So flower is basically going to be a specialized shoot with specialized leaves. And let's talk about these leaves. Number 1, you have the sepals. Sepals are usually green and look like just leaves, but those leaves are right next to the petals, just exterior to the petals, and those sepals are mainly for protection of the flower. We also have petals. Petals are basically going to be modified leaves that help attract pollinators. Interestingly, the color of the petal oftentimes reflects which animal is pollinating it. Oftentimes bees are attracted to red coloration. So these two flowers that we have here are probably bee pollinated. Yellow is usually a bird pollinated plant. And so the petal has evolved its color to attract the most efficient type of pollinator. You also see plants that don't rely on pollinators. There are some angiosperms that instead are pollinated by the wind, like gymnosperms. If you look at their flowers, they're usually really tiny. Their petals are white. Their petals are small. And it makes sense. They don't need to spend resources and energy to make these really colorful, showy, beautiful flowers when they don't depend on anybody to pollinate them anyway. And so they're really tiny and non-existent almost. Stamens. Stamens are the boy part of the flower. This is basically where the pollen is produced in the flower. And then we have carpels. Carpels are going to be the girl parts of the flower, and they have the ovules and the ovaries. Okay, we'll talk about all those boy and girl parts, the specifics of them in a bit. So here's basically a generalized overview of a flower. Notice your carpel is in the middle of the plant. In the middle of the flower. With your stamens, you have 6 stamens here on the outside. At the top of the stamen is the pollen-producing anther, and that anther is held up by that yellow stalk. That yellow stalk is called the filament. Okay, for the girl parts, the carpel, you have the stigma at the top, held up by the long style with the ovary with all the ovules in it. And then we have our sepals and our petals. So let's talk about the girl parts first. As I just mentioned, the carpel is basically the entirety of the female parts. I should mention that this is often, the entire female part is also often called the pistil, Pistil. And the pistil is oftentimes split longitudinally into multiple carpels. Okay, so carpels are sort of like the sections of the pistil. Some plants just have one carpel, some have multiple carpels. Think about an orange, right? You have all the slices of the orange. They're sort of naturally sliced into these little sections. Every one of those sections is a section of an ovary, right? The entire orange used to be an ovary, and every section is a section of that ovary. Well, that ovary used to be part of the pistil, and then every section used to be a carpel. Okay, and so you have multiple carpels inside of the pistil. And so you have the stigma at the top, and the long column there leading down to the ovary is a style. The stigma is the sticky part, and that's where the pollen usually lands. Within that ovary, right, the ovary is going to become the fruit. Within that ovary, you have usually multiple ovules. Okay, every one of those ovules is going to become, eventually, after fertilization, is going to become a seed. And so you have an ovary with multiple ovules inside. So the ovules, this is just like our discussion of our gymnosperms when we talked about the girl parts. The ovules, inside of them are the megasporangia. Inside of the megasporangium are the megasporocytes. Basically, I just added an extra step here and added megasporocyte, which is basically just these are the cells of the megasporangia that are going through meiosis to produce the megaspores. Okay, the megaspores is basically the female gametophyte, which is basically the egg. Okay, so the eggs are surrounded by the megasporangium, just like we had in the gymnosperms, except it was in a scale of a cone. Okay, so there are the specific parts there. Stigma at the top. Style is the long tube going down to the ovary. The ovary has multiple ovules within it. And then the ovules have the megasporangia within them. and the megasporangia are producing inside of them the megaspores, which is basically the egg or the female gametophyte. Okay. The boy parts, a little bit simpler. You have the stamen, like we saw in that first image. There's 6 stamen, and the stamen have a filament that is basically a stalk that leads up to the anther. The anther is where all the action happens. That's where the pollen is produced. So the anther contains the microsporangia, which produce the microsporocytes, which are creating the microspores. The microspores is basically the same thing as the male gametophyte, i.e. the pollen. Okay? So these are the microspores. And there's your boy parts. Anther at the top, filament holding the anther up. And that's called a stamen. So we need to talk about, pollination is basically just the process of pollen flying from the male parts to the girl parts, but you can have different types of pollination. What if that pollen goes from the pollen of one of your flowers, the male part of one of your flowers, to a female part on one of your own flowers again? That's called self-pollination. Okay, self-pollination is basically an asexual type of reproduction. The flower will get pollinated, it will get fertilized, it will produce a seed, but you're basically mixing your own genetics with your own genetics, right? It's your own male gamete with your own female gamete. That is not ideal. We want plants have evolved to favor cross-pollination, which is going to allow for genetic recombination, mixing of the genes, and therefore better adaptation in a changing environment, right? We talked about that with sexual reproduction. Advantageous in a changing environment because you get genetic recombination. And so flowers have evolved to emphasize or promote cross-pollination and de-emphasize and sometimes even completely prevent self-pollination. So, like we said, we have pollinators that are interacting with angiosperms, unlike gymnosperms, and these pollinators are in a mutualism with those angiosperms, where the pollinators are getting nectar, right? The bees or the birds or the bats are getting nectar from those flowers. They don't care about pollen. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know that they're spreading pollen to one flower to another. All they know is that there's food here, there's nectar here. I'm going to go get that nectar. But because they did this, they pollinate the plants. And so I talked about this a little bit, how flower morphology reflects a pollination method. Oftentimes red petals have insect pollinators. Some flowers rely on flies, carrion eating flies, to pollinate them. So they'll smell like rotting meat or decaying flesh, so that the flies will come to the flower thinking that it's rotting meat, and then they'll be pollinated accidentally. So flowers have all different kinds of methods to attract animals. In angiosperms, when you have fertilization occurring, so when you have pollination, pollination occurs first, right? The pollen gets transferred from the anther of a stamen to the stigma of a carpel, right? And then it will create a pollen tube down the stigma, down the style, all the way down to the ovary, into the ovary, towards an ovule, where that egg is, right? Really long pollen tube. And then the pollen will push those sperm through that pollen tube to that ovule. When that happens, inside that ovule, 2 different structures get fertilized. Number 1 is the one we already talked about in gymnosperms, and it's the same thing, the egg. The egg gets fertilized by the sperm, produces a baby angiosperm, an embryo. But In angiosperms, you also get a second thing that gets fertilized. So this is unique to angiosperms. This does not happen in gymnosperms. The second thing that gets fertilized is the central cell, something called the central cell. The central cell is basically the megasporangium. Remember the thing that surrounds the megaspore that produces the egg? That megasporangium, the central cell, gets fertilized by a second sperm cell. When that happens, it produces a structure called the endosperm. The endosperm is basically the nutrients of the seed. And so this is called double fertilization because two things are getting fertilized. The egg is getting fertilized and the central cell is getting fertilized. And you're producing in that seed now an embryo and its food package, the endosperm. And so basically when you're eating, back to that peanut again, when you're eating that peanut, you're basically eating 90% endosperm. You're eating the embryo's lunch. The embryo itself, if you ever broke a peanut open, you see that there's a tiny little raised portion of that peanut. That's the embryo. And so we're eating the embryo too. We're eating the baby. We're eating the baby and the baby's lunch. You jerk. And so this is called double fertilization. And so here is the angiosperm's life cycle. The angiosperm life cycle, again, this is very similar to the gymnosperm life cycle. Lots of words, look super complicated. It's not, if you know the gymnosperm life cycle, you pretty much know this one. The only big difference is that the structure names are slightly different. But you see on the outside here, the boy section is on the outside, the girl section is in the middle here. So you have the microsporangium is inside of the anther, right? And the microsporangium is producing the microspores, which is basically the pollen. So the pollen lands on the stigma, grows the pollen tube down. Pollen tube goes down the stigma, down the style, into the ovary, reaches the ovule. Meanwhile, in the ovule, this is the middle portion here, you have the megasporangium producing the megaspore, which is basically the egg. And as you can see here, the central cell is basically the megasporangium. And then you have, once you have, finally they meet, you have, just to the left of where it says discharged sperm nuclei, you have basically the sperm combining with the egg and combining with the central cell. And so voila, fertilization. And so now you have a seed. So you have your seed with your embryo, your endosperm, and of course your seed coat, which is now your seed coat, which is basically what we said, the integument, right? The integument turned into the seed coat, same thing. Notice also, interestingly, the endosperm is triploid, 3N. That's because if you look back in that middle line there, it says megasporangium 2N. Okay, the megasporangium is sporophytic. So since that sporophytic megasporangium gets fertilized by a haploid sperm, 2N plus 1N, 3N. Okay. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so what happens after that? After fertilization in the angiosperms, this is quite different than the gymnosperms because now we have to make a fruit. Because a lot of angiosperms depend on animals to eat the fruit, poop out the seed, or something along those lines where the seed is involved, the fruit's involved in spreading the seed somewhere and allowing it to germinate in a good environment. And so that fruit could be sticky, or like burrs where it sticks to people and travels fly away. You need to create that. So the seed, the formal ovule, basically, as we said before, contains those three things. The embryo, which is basically the egg plus the sperm. The endosperm, which is the central cell plus the sperm. And the seed coat, which is the old integument. So surrounding that, so remember we have the ovary, right? Sort of the middle of the flower. That ovary has within it the ovules, right? The ovules, every one of those ovules, if it gets fertilized, turns into a seed. So the entire ovary turns into the fruit, okay? And so the ovary wall, the wall of the ovary turns into something we call the pericarp. Okay, the pericarp is basically from the seed all the way to the edge of the fruit is the pericarp. Everything from all that is a pericarp. And so we have 3 layers there. We have an endocarp, which is the inner layer just outside the seed. We have the mesocarp, which is usually a fleshy middle part, but not always fleshy, but sometimes. And then we have an exocarp, which is the outer portion there. And you can see that here. Okay, exocarp, mesocarp, endocarp. And we'll talk about this in lab and show you a bunch of examples of endo, meso, exocarp. So those are basically how a fruit is created. And so a fruit used to be an ovary. And it contains the pericarp, which is the endo, exo, mesocarp. It contains all the seeds within inside it. And sometimes it even includes other flower parts that get added on. For example, your strawberry. The red that we associate with strawberry is not ovary. In fact, it's accessory parts of the flower external to the ovary that grow near the ovaries. And the actual ovaries in a strawberry are those little, what we call the seeds, those little yellowish things. Those are all the ovaries. So sometimes you have other flower parts contributing to what we call the fruit. Okay, fruit have lots of roles, right? Number 1, you want to protect what's inside the seeds until it's ready to germinate into a plant. And number 2, you want to aid in dispersal. So animals, largely is what we're talking about here, eating these fruits or carrying these fruits on their fur to other places or on their feathers or whatever. And so a lot of students gets confused with what a fruit is. All these things shown here are fruits, right? Olives are fruits. Corn is a fruit. Tomatoes are fruit. Zucchini, fruit. Pumpkins are fruit. Tomatoes are fruit. Rice is a fruit. Grain. Black pepper is a fruit. Basically ground up fruits. Peas. Anything you can think of with a seed is a fruit, period. And lots of adaptations. So they can get carried by the wind. Some of them have little wings, like you see right up here, like little wings. Some of them, like coconuts, right, get carried on the water. Some of them stick to animals, like you see with this poor dog. And some of them can run through the digestive tract of animals and then come out the other end and be just fine. And so whatever technique happens, the fruit gets carried away somehow. When it does, eventually it lands, the fruit decays, the seed is now coming in contact with the soil. This is when we have germination. Okay, and the number one step of germination that always has to occur is the seed has to take in water. If the seed does not take in water, if the seed, for example, is in a dehydrated environment, then it will not germinate. This is why you have seed vaults that specialize in storing dry seed, and their number one concern is humidity and moisture. Because once they have water hitting those seeds, they'll start to germinate, and then the seed is no longer a seed, right? And so once water gets into that seed, it activates internal enzymes to tell the seed to start breaking things down, start breaking down that endosperm, start breaking out of the seed and turn into a new plant. This is commonly called the imbibation of water. I-M-B-I-B-A-T-I-O-N, imbibation. So the endosperm, once that little plant germinates and grows, see what you see here? That is not a leaf. That is called a cotyledon. The cotyledon is basically the endosperm. So these are the first food reserves of that baby plant. So remember that peanut that we talked about. There's the embryo inside, and then it has those huge endosperms on either side. When it germinates, the embryo pushes up, the embryo grows into the plant, but while it's growing into the plant, the endosperm is on the sides of that growing plant, and basically the endosperm over time gets, which is now the cotyledons get smaller and smaller and smaller and shriveled and shriveled and shriveled, because all the nutrients within those cotyledons are getting sucked out by that growing embryo, and it's being used by the embryo to grow into a plant. So that's what cotyledons are for. They're basically the nutrient packs of the growing embryo. So let's talk about angiosperm diversity. There's 4 main groups of angiosperms. The first are the basal angiosperms. There's about 100 species here, but this is a polyphyletic group, so it's not a real, it's not like a true phylogenetic group, sort of an artifact of old research. So this could get changed later. And there's basically 3 lineages. Amborella trichopoda is basically the basal angiosperm group, the most primitive angiosperm, right there, Amborella. Water lilies, basically lily pads, are also basal angiosperms, very simple. And star anise, which is commonly used in, not commonly I guess, but it's also used as a spice. Star anise is also a basal angiosperm. Magnoliids is a second major group, about 8,000 species. A lot of magnoliids have within them oils that are commonly either narcotic or oftentimes very fragrant. And magnoliids, among these 8,000 species, magnoliids include the source of root beer flavoring. I say formally here because nowadays it's all artificial, but originally when root beer was made, it was made with the ground up parts of a root of a particular magnoliid, and that gives it that specific root beer flavor. Black pepper is a magnoliid, avocados, nutmeg, cinnamon, bay leaves, kava, which is a Polynesian beverage that helps with hallucinations, is a magnoliid. And many poisons and perfumes are magnoliids. Again, you see it. You should hopefully see a pattern here. Nutmeg, right? Very fragrant. Cinnamon, fragrant. Bay, fragrant. Avocados, lots of oils. Black pepper, fragrant. All these things, a lot of oils and fragrant substances within the magnoliids. Our third and fourth groups are the most diverse of all the angiosperm groups, the monocots and unicots. About a quarter of all angiosperms are monocots, so we're talking about 70,000 species are monocots. And we call them monocots because they only have one cotyledon when they grow up as a seedling. If you've ever seen a corn seedling, it only has one cotyledon on the side, it is a monocot. About 2/3 of angiosperms are eudicots. So, of course, eu meaning true, di meaning two, and cots meaning cotyledons. So we have 2 cotyledons as a seedling. Like that picture I showed you when I talked about cotyledons, that was a eudicot. So we have a 170,000 species of eudicots. So by far the most advanced and the most successful plants on Earth today are eudicots within the angiosperms. So let's talk a little bit about the differences here. Monocots, as we said, 1 cotyledon. Unicots have 2. Now, we'll see this in lab, but this is probably the easiest way to tell a monocot from unicot is looking at the leaves. In monocots, you have veins in the leaves that are usually parallel. In eudicots, they sort of branch out, and they have branching upon branching. Within the stems, we'll look at this in lab too. The vascular tissue, basically the xylem and the phloem, is basically all scattered in the stems. But in unicots, it's arranged in a very orderly little ring, and we'll see that under the microscope. Monocot roots are commonly fibrous. Eudicots often have a main taproot. Think of something if taken to the extreme, that's like a carrot, right? Major taproot right in the middle. Pollen grains have one opening in monocots. They have 3 openings in eudicots. And for the flowers, and this is also going to be very useful, especially in lab and on the practical, if I showed you a flower, you should be able to tell if it's a monocot flower or a eudicot flower. The way to tell is monocots have petals and other organs like stamens in multiples of 3. So 3, 6, 9 petals or stamens. Eudicots have multiples of 4 or 5. So 4, 5, 8, 10. When it comes to monocots, many plants you're familiar with are monocots. Here's a list of some things: orchids, rice, wheat, corn, sugar, bamboo, palm, onion. All these are monocots. Notice a lot of these are also staples, so food that is used by us as main crops in agricultural fields. So rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and that's because a lot of monocots grow in tropical habitats, and they grow very efficiently there. And a lot of our crops grow there too. Eudicots, basically everything else, right? So why are eudicots much more successful than monocots? And there's been several hypotheses as to why this is, but one of the main ones is that eudicots have 3 pollen openings, where monocots have 1 pollen opening. And this may allow eudicots to have a better chance at better chance at pollination, successful pollination and fertilization, allowing for the sperm to get out of the pollen, where if you only have 1 opening and that's blocked or mutated somehow, then you do not have a way to get out, and pollination and fertilization would not occur. So that's one of the hypotheses as to why eudicots are much more successful. And that's it.